Hi there, students. To cope, to cope with something, to deal to deal successfully with something difficult. Yeah, it's very difficult to cope at work because there's a huge amount of work and very little time to do it in. It can be difficult to cope with young children and work at the same time. There was so much pressure on him that he just couldn't cope. He couldn't cope with the situation. Okay, so he couldn't deal with it, to deal successfully with. So if you cope with a task or a problem, you are successful in handling it. You're successful in managing it. If you're in an unpleasant situation, you have to cope with it. Just accept it, deal with it, bear with it. Yeah. So people have had to cope with lockdown as best they can. He lost his job, and and the family had to cope with less money to manage and handle and accept the situation. If a machine has to cope with something, it's either big enough or complicated enough to deal with it satisfactorily. So the machine can't cope with such high demand. Yeah, it's the this drill can't cope with such a hard surface. It's very difficult. It's very difficult for it to go through it, and it just can't cope. It can't deal with it. Yeah, you need a new drill to cope with this. Hospitals have had problems coping with the number of patients, number of COVID patients. Yeah. The number of people asking for a refund was more than the customer service department could cope with. Okay, so to cope, to deal effectively with something, his ability to cope with stress, to deal with stress, to have the capacity to deal with something in a proper way, to manage, to make do, to survive, to contend with, to get by, to get along. Okay? So to deal effectively with something, especially if something is very difficult. Yeah? When you are beset by problems, if you can't solve them, then you're going to have to cope with them. Yeah, to do what you can. Okay, cope. A couple of other meanings, but these are really rather unusual ones. Firstly, you could have a coping saw to cope. This way you cut a joint out of two bits of wood. You cut a bit out of this one, the bit out of this one, and they join together. Yeah? You would use a coping saw to do that. You could put a coping on the top of a brick wall, a covering to go on the top. And also a cope, a long cloak, this long thing worn by a priest, particularly in a ceremony. You know, this thing, it comes down like this. This is actually a cope as well. But these are unusual meanings. Okay, so to cope with a situation, to strive with it on even terms. My team found it difficult to cope with the opposition, to contend on even terms, to cope with, to try to overcome difficulties. Yeah, he coped well with the problem. I will try and cope with the difficult situation. let's see. We need some favors from this guy, so we're going to just have to cope with his unpleasant manner. After his wife left him, he just couldn't cope with all of the different things that he had to do. So, to cope, to manage, to get by, to struggle through, to rise to the occasion, to carry on, yeah, to hold your own, to deal with, to contend with, to wrestle with. So I think you're probably coping with English quite well. Yeah, when you have a native speaker in front of you who you don't understand very well, you have to cope with the situation as best you can. Okay? To cope. Formality. This is a 5 in formality. Use it absolutely anywhere. And then as to origin, well, from Old French, couper, to cut or to strike or to hit, which itself probably comes from Latin colpare, to separate, yeah, or something like that. To behead maybe as well. So enough. If you enjoyed the video, give it a rating, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now. To cope with.